Welcome to The Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unearth the most important insights, turning information overload into informed understanding. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into something really fascinating and profoundly important. Global issues that, despite having a massive human impact, often just go underreported or completely unseen. Have you ever wondered why some crises grab all the headlines while others, maybe affecting millions, just stay in the shadows?
It's a really critical question.
Yeah. So that's our mission today.
Yeah.
Understand what makes an issue invisible, why that matters to you, and who's actually working to bring these hidden stories out into the light.
It is critical because, we often just assume the biggest problems get the most attention.
Right.
But as our sources today reveal, that's often just not the case at all. We'll be exploring how things like demographics, technology access, even, the very nature of conflict shapes what the world sees, or crucially, what it doesn't see.
We have some really compelling material today. I think it's going to challenge some common assumptions, reveal some surprising facts about these overlooked challenges. So let's explore this together. First up, let's unpack a huge demographic shift, one that's maybe more complex than it seems at first glance: global aging.
Precisely. And our sources really highlight this. More than half the world's older people, they live in developing countries.
Wow, more than half.
Yeah. And by 2025, just around the corner, Asia alone is projected to have nearly 60% of the global total.
60%.
And what's truly significant, maybe the key point here, is that the over 80s, they're the fastest growing group among older populations worldwide.
When you hear aging population, I think for many people, the immediate thought is often burden, right? Concerns about healthcare costs, income support, family having to step in. But our sources seem to really challenge that narrow view.
Yeah.
What are the benefits here that get overlooked?
That's such a crucial distinction. The text points out that, for many of the 550 million people over 60 globally, age is the label that makes other aspects of their lives invisible.
Yeah.
There's this pervasive belief almost that old age is a disease. But the sources powerfully assert, and this is a direct quote, that poverty remains the great disease for older people in the developing world, not old age.
That really reframes it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Poverty, not age itself.
It fundamentally reorients the perspective, yes.
And the speed of this shift is also just remarkable. It took France, 115 years for its older population to go from 7% to 14%?
A long time.
A very long time. But in some developing countries, that same kind of change is happening in just 20 years.
20 years! It's incredibly rapid.
Take Bangladesh, for example. The number of older people there is set to jump from 6 million to 17 million by 2025.
Huge increase.
So it's really a myth that older populations aren't a major factor in developing countries. A woman aged 65 in Bangladesh can expect to live another 13 years.
Absolutely. And this kind of rapid change, it's not just a number on a page. It fundamentally reshapes everything healthcare needs, social support systems, in ways many nations just aren't prepared for.
Which leads to the obvious question.
Right. If this shift is so fast and so significant, why is it so often ignored in development policy?
Exactly.
We saw an attempt to address this back in 1998 with the International Year of Older Persons, the IYOP. It was championed by figures like Nelson Mandela,
Oh, okay.
and it aimed to promote principles like independence, participation, care, dignity. But, the challenge clearly persists.
And the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, they make a really critical point here, don't they?
They do. They argue that an aging population is a resource, not inherently a burden, but
There's always a but.
it will become a burden, and here's their condition, unless policy and investments are focused on the capacity of older people.
The capacity, that's the key word.
Absolutely. And we see this really clearly when we look at things like dependency ratios, these measures comparing people over 60 to those aged, say, 20 to 59.
Those ratios that sometimes get used to paint a crisis picture.
Exactly. Some scholars argue they've been used precisely to create this sense of an old age crisis. But then you look at studies like from the ILO, the International Labor Organization,
Right.
in 20 African countries. They suggest between 74% and 91% of people over 65 are still working.
Well, that high.
Yeah. So the problem isn't really age itself. It's policy that just doesn't account for their ongoing economic activity, especially, in poorer communities in the non-formal sector.
And the sources talk about the doubly marginal. Who are they referring to?
That's those who are both poor and old. The case studies, like one from Buenos Aires, they show many older residents get absolutely no family support.
None at all.
No. They're relying entirely on their own strategies, maybe some charity, sometimes even scavenging from rubbish tips to survive.
Just completely off the grid of any formal support system.
Exactly. And what's striking here, sort of the flip side, is the crucial contribution these older people often make, particularly in poor communities.
How so?
Well, often as carers. Carers for children, for people with AIDS, for those with disabilities.
Ah, right. Filling a vital gap.
A vital gap. So channeling resources to support these older carers. The sources frame that not as a burden, but as a genuine investment in the society's health.
That makes sense.
And gender plays a huge role here, too. Women often dominate the older age groups, and they're more likely to be unresourced, unpartnered.
And probably under-researched, too.
Massively under-researched. Social science has tended to focus on women within the reproductive lifespan, so older women's specific challenges often remain, well, invisible.
Okay, so from overlooked demographics, let's pivot a bit. Let's consider another major gap that, yeah, we talk about it, but billions are still left behind.
Yeah.
Global technology access.
Right, the digital divide. And the internet's growth has been, truly unprecedented, hasn't it?
Phenomenal speed.
Radio took 30 years to reach 50 million listeners. TV took 13 years. The internet, just 4.
4 years. Incredible.
Our sources highlight that many developing countries don't necessarily welcome this tech with open arms.
Why not?
Well, often due to concerns about Western influences, cultural impact, or sometimes it's simply a lack of foundational resources, basic infrastructure.
So what does this actually mean on the ground for those without access? We know the advantages of the internet are huge, boosting economies, quality of life, fair trade.
Massive advantages. But the challenges for those left out are just as daunting.
Yeah?
We're talking about a really significant digital divide. The sources point out, for example, 23% of the world's population lives in Southeast Asia,
Okay.
but only 1% of that population uses the internet.
Only 1%.
1%. Or think about parts of Africa where there might be only one telephone for every 1,000 people.
1,000 people.
How can you even begin to integrate the internet when you lack basic things like reliable electricity or even running water?
It puts it in perspective.
The real insight here isn't just that some people lack internet access, it's that this divide actively prevents economic mobility. It prevents civic participation for billions. It essentially creates these parallel worlds.
And a cost must be a huge factor, too.
Oh, absolutely. A basic PC in Africa can be almost 50% more expensive than in the US.
50% more.
Yeah. And dial-up fees, where that's still relevant, can be outrageous for just short online sessions. Plus, you have the language barrier. English still dominates the internet.
Right. Another hurdle.
So this raises a really important question. If integrating this technology is supposedly so beneficial for global growth, for poverty reduction, why the resistance?
What do the sources say?
Well, for many cultures, the core belief is that this technology, especially coming from the West, is a form of corruption and evil influence.
Really? Corruption.
Yes. Concerns about freedom of expression clashing with local norms, worries about religious or political influence, harmful content like pornography. It's not just about infrastructure, it's deeply cultural.
So given all that, what can be done to bridge this divide?
The sources suggest a few angles. One is definitely cost reduction, things like undersea cables, developing low-cost computers.
Makes sense.
And another major focus has to be on education and training, empowering local communities to actually use and adapt to the technology.
But there's a political dimension too, isn't there?
Absolutely vital. For successful integration, you often need a democratic political structure. Without it, people's rights get overlooked.
Right.
Autocratic governments can hinder development, perpetuate poverty, control information flow. And the sources mention that past aid programs from developed countries haven't always worked out well.
How so?
Sometimes they've even led to more corruption. So it just highlights how complex this web of challenges really is. It's not just about plugging things in.
Okay, so we've touched on overlooked people, overlooked access to technology. Now, let's turn to maybe the starkest example of global oversight. Conflicts. Conflicts that cause immense human suffering, but stay almost entirely hidden from view. What our sources call stealth conflicts.
Yes, stealth conflicts. And what's really striking, maybe disturbing, is that there's often very little correlation between how severe a conflict is and how much coverage it gets in, say, Western media.
So the worst ones aren't necessarily the ones we hear about.
Not at all. For instance, the Norwegian Refugee Council frequently points to African conflicts as being among the most overlooked crises. They note that up to 88% of all conflict victims globally are from Africa.
88%.
Yet academically, conflicts in Southeast Asia are often among the least covered.
So what defines a stealth conflict? It's not just one that's over and forgotten.
No, exactly. It's currently ongoing. But it systematically fails to get conscious attention from policymakers, from the media, the public, even academia.
So they're not just overlooked, they're almost actively ignored.
You could say that. It's a systematic lack of attention.
So what makes a conflict fall into this stealth category? What are the conditions?
Well, our sources look at a comprehensive theory by Virgil Hawkins, who's a key scholar in this area. He outlines 6 factors, but the research really boils it down to 2 primary sort of necessary conditions for a conflict to remain stealth.
Okay, what are they?
First, low simplicity. The conflict is complex, it's obscure, the causes and consequences are multifaceted. It's just hard for outsiders to quickly understand what's going on.
Right, no easy narrative.
Exactly. And second, low sensationalism. It lacks those dramatic, attention-grabbing events, big explosions, sudden attacks, the things that immediately capture media headlines.
So if it's complicated and doesn't produce shocking images or simple stories, it gets ignored.
Systematically ignored, yes. Think about places the sources mention, like West Papua, Cabinda, Balochistan. These often fall into the stealth category precisely because they fit this profile.
That makes sense.
Although Darfur is mentioned as an interesting exception, isn't it?
How so?
Well, it has been portrayed with high levels of sensationalism because of the really severe human rights abuses.
So it got attention.
It got some attention, yes. But this suggests that while sensationalism can draw temporary attention, other factors, like maybe a lack of direct national interest from powerful Western countries, or the underlying complexity, can still mean it remains effectively a stealth conflict in terms of sustained policy engagement or deep academic focus.
So even shocking events might not be enough for long-term, meaningful attention.
Exactly. Fleeting attention can sometimes be almost as problematic as no attention at all.
And the implications of this selective attention, they must be profound.
Absolutely profound. It means millions of people affected by these invisible crises might not get the humanitarian aid they need.
No diplomatic interventions.
Little or none. No international pressure that might actually help towards a resolution. The world simply doesn't know enough, or perhaps doesn't care enough, to act.
And when these conflicts are stealth, what often goes unseen alongside the fighting itself are the human rights violations. Correct. Often happening on a devastating scale.
Yes, exactly. Human rights, we think of them as universal moral entitlements, the right to life, safety, justice, dignity.
The fundamentals.
The absolute fundamentals. But what our sources reveal is how disturbingly easy it is for these principles to be violated, completely denied, when a crisis remains stealth. Individuals are treated, as the text says, as if they are less than human, often without any global outcry.
And the range of abuses described is just staggering.
It really is. We're talking about crimes against humanity, things like genocide, torture, slavery, widespread rape.
Horrific.
The sources also highlight specific war crimes, direct attacks on civilians, even firing on undefended places like hospitals. And sexual violence and conflict is described as widespread, often used systematically to destroy community pride or simply terrorize populations into submission.
Yeah, and then there are the disappearances.
Deeply disturbing. People taken into custody, held secretly, often tortured, killed, then buried in unmarked graves, specifically to conceal the crime.
To erase them.
To erase them and erase the act itself. And this raises a critical question the sources touch on. How can you possibly have reconciliation or peace building later on when these memories of severe, unacknowledged violence are still so central for the communities affected?
If it's never brought to light, how can healing even begin?
Precisely. The lack of visibility actively prevents that healing process.
So what is this pattern, this link between stealth conflicts and rights abuses? Tell us about how to address them.
Well, the sources emphasize a kind of vicious cycle. Human rights abuses often lead to conflict in the first place.
Okay.
Denial of basic economic or political rights fuels social unrest. And then the conflict itself inevitably results in even more abuses.
Trapping communities.
Exactly, trapping them in this cycle of violence and deprivation.
So if we want to address the violations,
We have to understand the root causes. Things like underdevelopment, economic pressures, those complex political and social problems we talked about. It's not just about stopping the immediate violence. It's about strengthening the very fabric of civil society itself.
Which brings us back, I suppose, to who actually takes action and how these stories finally get illuminated.
Exactly. Who makes the invisible visible?
Okay, so while these challenges, the aging population, the digital divide, these stealth conflicts seem just immense, our sources do offer some really powerful insights into how these invisible crises are being brought to light. And this is where the story starts to shift, I think, towards real agency.
Yes, and it raises that crucial question again. Who truly has the legitimacy to speak for the people most affected?
Right. Who gets to tell the story?
And our sources introduce this really powerful concept, transnational grassroots movements. These are movements formed and, crucially, led by the poor and marginalized groups themselves.
So not outside NGOs coming in, but the communities themselves organizing globally.
Precisely. And it's presented as a direct challenge to that traditional view of global civil society, where often, northern or maybe elite NGOs dominate the advocacy space.
And sometimes sideline the very communities they're meant to represent.
Exactly. One source even mentions grassroots groups feeling used just to establish an NGO's legitimacy.
Wow.
There's a really powerful quote included from a grassroots women's leader, Sundarama. She told outside activists, "In the beginning, you may walk in front of us. After a while, as we grow stronger, you must walk beside us. But finally, you must learn to walk behind us."
Walk behind us. That's a complete redefinition of partnership, isn't
A
it?
total redefinition. And the sources give a couple of standout examples that really embody this philosophy.
Okay, like what?
Well, first there's WIEGO, that's Women in the Informal Economy, Globalizing and Organizing.
We go. Okay.
It's a global network created by groups like HomeNet and SIWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. They've built this international platform for women in informal work. Think street vendors, home-based workers.
The kind of workers often completely invisible in official statistics.
Exactly. And they successfully lobbied for the ILO, the International Labor Organization Convention on Homework. And they actively work with the UN Statistics Division to make these informal workers statistically visible to policymakers, giving them data, giving them recognition.
Making them count, literally. What's the second example?
The second is SDI Slum Shack Dwellers International.
STI.
Founded by federations of the urban poor themselves, they represent over 1 million people across 11 countries, and critically, their NGO partners play a supportive role, not a leadership one.
Walking behind.
They've driven really innovative strategies like community-managed censuses to challenge flawed official data. They push for formal recognition of pavement dwellers' resettlement rights in India.
Real policy impact.
Huge impact. They even convinced the World Bank in India to open up tendering for urban sanitation projects to community federations. Their argument: that social expertise on the ground was more important than just technical know-how.
That's fascinating, challenging the World Bank's usual procedures.
Right. And both WIEGO and SDI, they demonstrate what the sources call an empowered stance, meaning they don't approach this as victims pleading for help. They see themselves as playing vital roles in economies, providing critical services. They demand to be taken seriously.
They're not just presenting problems, they're bringing solutions.
Exactly. And they make really powerful use of research and data research that's owned and controlled by the movements themselves to directly challenge policy assumptions.
So they own their narrative, own their data.
Precisely. And this showcases a crucial shift, a rebalancing of that power dynamic between, say, outside practitioners or scholars and the communities themselves. These movements initiate and control the research to ensure it directly benefits their struggle.
And their success comes from?
The sources point to their mass base, their direct accountability back to their members, often a women-centered approach, and this ability to come to the negotiating table with concrete strategies, not just complaints.
That's really powerful. But it's not just large movements, is it? The sources also highlight the role of individual journalists.
Absolutely. The indispensable power of investigative journalism in uncovering these hidden issues.
How did that work on a global scale for these underreported stories?
Well, investigative journalism, as the sources explain it, kind of thrives on the fact that corruption and abuses of power often share similar patterns across borders.
Ah, so techniques can be shared.
Exactly. Successful stories and the methods used to uncover them can often be replicated globally.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Investigating something like femicide, it's not just about finding the data. It's about understanding how or even if it's recorded in a country's legal system.
The gaps in the data itself can be the story.
Precisely. Reporters are advised to use things like data visualization, collaborate across borders, and also, crucially, to prioritize their own emotional well-being because digging into these stories is often incredibly taxing.
I can imagine. What other examples?
Well, investigating dangerous land grabbing. Key techniques there involve building deep trust with local communities and using tools like digital mapping to document encroachment.
Using tech again.
Yes. Or exposing pension system corruption. There was a case in Latin America where something like $500 billion in pension funds had unknown uses. Uncovering that required cross-border collaboration using freedom of information laws.
Following the money.
Always follow the money. The Vacunagate scandal in Peru is another example.
I remember hearing about that.
High-ranking officials secretly getting COVID vaccines early because of Chinese influence. That story, or variations of it, was replicated across Latin America by journalists meticulously tracking drug import data.
Just dogged investigation.
Exactly. And then there's this whole fascinating area of U.S. dark money.
Dark money.
Yeah, the trillions of dollars held in U.S. nonprofit assets that are incredibly active worldwide, but often operate completely under the radar, widely unreported.
Trillions. How do you even track that?
Journalists can use tools like ProPublica's Nonprofit Explorer in the U.S. to trace the funding flows. They can uncover who's funding campaigns against, say, same-sex marriage in other countries, or spreading specific kinds of misinformation globally. It reveals hidden lines of influence.
So it connects local issues back to these global financial flows.
Precisely. So what does this all really signify for us?
Well, it seems like both these grassroots movements, driven by the affected communities and dedicated investigative journalism, play absolutely vital roles.
Yeah, they pierce through that veil of invisibility.
They transform these complex, often under-sensationalized issues into something actionable, into knowledge we can actually use.
They don't just report the problems, they illuminate pathways towards potential change.
Okay, so we've taken quite a deep dive today. We've looked at the world of underreported global issues, from the rapidly aging population in developing countries, that persistent digital divide, the stark reality of stealth conflicts, and the human rights impacts that go with them, all the way through to the incredible work being done by grassroots movements and investigative journalists who are really fighting to bring these stories into the light.
I think the core insight really is that visibility isn't automatic, even for the most critical global challenges.
It has to be fought for.
It has to be fought for. It's often determined by these factors we discussed: complexity, sensationalism, national interest. But conversely, strategic action by those directly affected, when coupled with dedicated, rigorous reporting, can profoundly reshape what the world chooses to see and, hopefully, what it chooses to act upon.
Understanding these dynamics, then, means recognizing that the information we consume, or maybe more importantly, the information we don't consume it, actively shapes global attention. It shapes where resources go.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that behind every statistic, every policy brief, there are real human lives.
Right.
And there are powerful forces working either to obscure their realities or to reveal them.
Absolutely.
So maybe this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener. In a world where clearly so much remains hidden, what role do you play? How do you seek out the unseen? And how do you support and amplify the voices that are demanding to be heard?
A really important question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep getting informed.